Welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting slowly into the complete lore of William Afton, the man behind the mask, the architect of tragedy, and the restless remnant who refused to stay dead. From his beginnings as a creative robotics engineer in Hurricane, Utah, to his transformation into something far more sinister than human, William Afton's story weaves through decades of horror, innovation, and obsession. We'll trace his partnership with Henry Emily and the birth of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, his descent into murder and the loss of his own children, his death inside a springlock suit and rebirth as Springtrap, his burning in the fires of Fazbear's Fright and return as Scraptrap, and his final manifestations as a digital virus and a burnt, skeletal creature still clinging to existence. This is a tale of a man who sought something beyond death, who experimented with remnant and agony, who destroyed families while losing his own, and who became the very thing he tried to control. Whether you're uncovering these details for the first time, letting familiar echoes pull you deeper into rest, or simply allowing the tale to wash over you like a gentle fog as sleep takes hold, this will carry you through the full, unbroken history of William Afton, the man who always comes back. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy this kind of slow, immersive storytelling that unfolds like a dream. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a quiet wonder to see the same story weaving through different corners of the world, one hushed night at a time. Let's begin. Part 1. The Beginning, the Man Before the Monster. In the quiet town of Hurricane, Utah, sometime in the late 1970s, a man with a gift for engineering and robotics began to dream of something new. William Afton, a British immigrant whose accent carried traces of a homeland left behind, possessed a sharp mind for mechanics and an even sharper ambition. He was tall, thin, with a presence that could fill a room even when he stood in silence. Those who knew him in these early years describe a man of contradictions, charming yet distant, brilliant yet unsettling, capable of creating wonder with his hands while harboring something cold behind his eyes. William was not alone in his vision. He found a partner in Henry Emily, a gentler soul whose passion for robotics matched his own, but whose motivations came from a place of pure creativity and joy. Where William saw potential and control, Henry saw magic and happiness. Together, these two men formed a partnership that would change the landscape of family entertainment, though neither could have predicted the darkness that would eventually consume their creation. Their friendship, built on shared dreams of animatronic entertainment, was the foundation upon which an empire would rise and, eventually, crumble into ash and sorrow. The duo opened their first establishment, Fredbear's Family Diner, a modest restaurant featuring two springlock animatronics, Fredbear, a golden bear with a purple hat and bow tie, and Spring Bonnie, a yellow rabbit with a cheerful grin. These weren't ordinary animatronics, stationary figures programmed to repeat the same motions endlessly. No, William and Henry had created something revolutionary. The springlock suits could function as both animatronics and wearable costumes, allowing employees to entertain children from inside the very characters they'd built. The mechanism was ingenious, a series of spring-loaded locks that would retract the animatronic components, creating a hollow space for a human to occupy. When locked in place, the employee could move, speak, and perform as the character, bringing them to life in a way that delighted children and impressed investors. But this innovation carried a terrible danger, a flaw that would eventually claim lives in the most horrific way imaginable. The spring locks, when functioning properly, held back hundreds of pounds of animatronic parts, sharp metal edges, crossbeams, and gears. If they were triggered by moisture, sudden movement, or mechanical failure, they would snap closed with tremendous force, driving all those components into the body of whoever was inside. The results were catastrophic, a death so gruesome that it inspired fear even among those who worked with the suits. Warning signs were posted, training videos created, and employees were instructed never to breathe too heavily, never to move too quickly, never to allow even a drop of sweat to touch the mechanisms. Yet accidents happened, enough that the company would eventually retire the spring lock suits entirely, relegating them to back rooms and storage, too dangerous to use but too expensive to destroy. William Afton wore the spring Bonnie suit often in those early days, entertaining children with a performance that was equal parts enchanting and slightly off-putting. There was something in the way he moved, too precise, too controlled, as if the man inside was calculating every gesture. Children laughed and clapped, unaware of the coldness behind the costume's painted smile. Henry, by contrast, wore the Fredbear suit with genuine warmth, his movements softer, his voice kinder. The difference between them was subtle but present, visible to anyone who paid close enough attention. Yet Fredbear's family diner thrived, drawing families from across Hurricane and beyond, its reputation growing alongside William and Henry's ambitions. As the diner's success grew, so did William's family. He married a woman whose name has been lost to time, a figure who exists in the narrative only as a shadow, present but never truly seen. Together they had 3 children: Michael, the eldest, a boy who would grow to carry the weight of his father's sins; Elizabeth, a daughter with a curiosity that would lead to tragedy; and a younger son, often called the crying child, whose fears and tears marked him from the start. William's relationship with his children was complicated, distant yet possessive, a father who provided but did not nurture, who saw them perhaps as extensions of himself rather than individuals deserving of love. His wife, by most accounts, tried to fill the emotional void her husband left, but the cracks in their family ran deep, fissures that would only widen with time. Michael, the eldest, bore the brunt of William's expectations and indifference. He was a boy seeking his father's approval, acting out in ways that ranged from typical sibling cruelty to genuinely dangerous behavior. His relationship with his younger brother was marked by bullying, wearing frightening masks, and tormenting the crying child with threats of the animatronics the boy so feared. Whether this cruelty was learned from observing his father or born from frustration at his father's neglect remains unclear. But Michael's actions would set in motion events that would haunt him for the rest of his life and beyond. Elizabeth, William's daughter, was different. She was fascinated by her father's work, drawn to the animatronics with a child's wonder and a dangerous lack of caution. William noticed this fascination, and in his mind, wheels began to turn. If Henry created out of love for his daughter Charlotte, perhaps William could create something for Elizabeth, a gesture that might appear fatherly, but carried with it William's typical complexity of motive. This thought would lead to the creation of Circus Baby, an animatronic that would seal Elizabeth's fate in the most terrible way. The younger son, the crying child, was the most vulnerable of William's children. He was afraid of everything, the animatronics most of all, crying at the sight of them, having nightmares where they transformed into monsters with sharp teeth and grasping hands. His fears were not unfounded. There was something uncanny about the animatronics, something that spoke to a primal unease even children could sense. William's response to his youngest son's fears was not comfort, but frustration, perhaps even contempt. A weak child was an inconvenient child in William's worldview, a variable that didn't fit into his carefully constructed plans. As Fredbear's family diner flourished, William and Henry began to expand their vision. They opened Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a larger establishment with a full cast of animatronic characters. Freddy Fazbear, the titular brown bear and leader of the band. Bonnie, a blue rabbit with a guitar. Chica, a yellow chicken with a bib reading "Let's Eat." And Foxy, a pirate fox tucked away in his own cove. These animatronics were more advanced than Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, purpose-built for performance rather than the dual function of the Springlock suits. They sang, they danced, they entertained, and children loved them. The pizza was mediocre, the carpet stained and worn, but none of that mattered when the band took the stage and music filled the air. Henry poured his heart into Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, designing every detail with care, creating animatronics that could bring joy to thousands of children. His daughter, Charlotte Emily, called Charlie by those who knew her, was the light of his life, the reason behind his every creation. William watched Henry's devotion to Charlie with something that might have been envy or might have been disdain, the sentiment difficult to parse in a man who revealed so little of his inner world. What is certain is that William's mind was turning toward darker pursuits, his fascination shifting from creation to something more sinister, more fundamental. He had become interested in something he would later call remnant, a force tied to life itself, to emotion, to the boundary between the living and the dead. Remnant, as William would come to understand it, was not simply a philosophical concept, but something tangible, measurable, and, most importantly, extractable. It was the essence that lingered when someone died with strong emotion, particularly fear, agony, or rage. It could be harvested, stored, and even injected into inanimate objects, giving them a form of artificial life, a haunting presence that defied natural law. The animatronics, with their metal endoskeletons and complex circuitry, were perfect vessels for such experiments. All William needed was a source of remnant, which meant he needed subjects, which meant he needed to do something terrible. The exact moment when William Afton decided to become a murderer is lost to time, a private crossing of a threshold that he likely didn't even recognize as significant. Perhaps he told himself it was for science, for discovery, for pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Perhaps he didn't bother justifying it at all. What matters is that William Afton began to plan, and when William Afton planned, he was thorough, methodical, and patient. He would need the right circumstances, the right opportunity, and, most importantly, the right disguise to ensure he could act without consequence. The Spring Bonnie suit, with its friendly yellow exterior and association with happy memories, would serve his purposes perfectly. Children trusted Spring Bonnie, approached him willingly, followed him without question. William had built the suit himself, knew every mechanism, every vulnerability, every capability. It would become his tool, his weapon, his second skin. Inside that suit, William Afton could disappear, replaced by a character children loved. A rabbit that smiled and waved and led them away from safety into darkness. But before the murders that would define him began, tragedy struck William's own family. A tragedy that some believe triggered his descent, while others argue merely accelerated an inevitable fall. The year was 1983, and William's youngest son, the crying child, was celebrating his birthday at Fredbear's family diner. The boy didn't want to be there, his fears of the animatronics making the entire event a nightmare rather than a celebration. Michael, his older brother, along with a group of friends wearing masks resembling the Freddy characters, decided to play a cruel prank. They grabbed the crying boy, lifting him despite his screams and pleas, carrying him toward the stage where Fredbear was performing. The boy's cries grew more desperate, his terror absolute as they brought him closer to the animatronic he feared most. Michael, in a moment of cruelty that would haunt him forever, lifted his brother up to Fredbear's mouth, perhaps intending only to frighten him, to make him face his fears in the most traumatic way possible. What happened next occurred in seconds, a horrific convergence of bad timing and mechanical failure. Fredbear's jaw, triggered by some malfunction or simply the proximity of the boy's head, clamped down with tremendous force. The spring locks, those dangerous mechanisms William and Henry had designed, failed catastrophically. The sound, witnesses would later recall, was sickening, a crunch that no one present would ever forget. The crying child's skull was crushed, his small body going limp in an instant. Blood pooled on the floor as adults rushed forward, as Michael stood frozen in shock, as the animatronic continued its programmed movements, unaware that it had just killed a child. The boy was rushed to the hospital, placed on life support while his brain showed minimal activity. He lingered for days, dying slowly while his family kept vigil, the flat line of the monitor eventually marking the end of William Afton's youngest son. This event, known as the Bite of '83, would become infamous in the history of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a tragedy that should have ended the company, but instead was covered up, minimized, and gradually forgotten by all but those directly affected. William's reaction to his son's death is difficult to characterize. There was no public display of grief, no breakdown, no visible change in his demeanor. If anything, he became more focused on his work, more obsessed with his experiments, as if his son's death had simply confirmed something he already suspected about the nature of life, death, and what might lie between. Henry, by contrast, was devastated, his guilt over the spring-lock mechanisms weighing heavily on him, his partnership with William beginning to show strain. The two men spoke less, shared less, each retreating into their own private worlds as Freddy Fazbear's Pizza continued operating. The show going on despite the tragedy that had unfolded on its stage. Michael, too, was shattered by what he had done, consumed by guilt that would eventually transform him into something else. Someone driven by the need to undo what he had caused, even if it meant walking into hell itself. But that transformation would take time, years of festering guilt before it manifested in action. For now, Michael was simply a boy who had killed his brother, living in a house with a father who barely acknowledged the death and a mother who was falling apart. Elizabeth, William's daughter, remained fascinated by the animatronics despite what had happened to her brother. Her obsession focused particularly on Circus Baby, an animatronic her father had designed specifically for a new venture called Circus Baby's Pizza World. This was William's project, separate from Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a place where he could implement his darker experiments without Henry's oversight. Circus Baby was beautiful, designed to appeal specifically to young girls with her bright red pigtails, her colorful costume, and her ability to sing and dispense ice cream. But hidden within Baby's chassis was something terrible, a claw mechanism designed to grab and pull inward, to trap and capture whatever was placed in front of her. William had built a killing machine and disguised it as a children's entertainer. The purpose of this mechanism remains debated among those who study William Afton's crimes. Some believe it was designed specifically to harvest remnant, to kill children in a way that would allow him to extract their essence and inject it into the animatronics. Others suggest it was meant as insurance, a way to dispose of evidence should his other murders risk exposure. What is certain is that William warned Elizabeth to stay away from Circus Baby, one of the few times he gave his daughter direct instruction. Perhaps he feared for her, or perhaps he simply feared the complications her death would cause for his experiments. Either way, Elizabeth, like many children told not to do something, became more determined to approach the very thing she was forbidden to touch. On the day Circus Baby's Pizza World was set to open, an event that was meant to launch William's new franchise and secure his financial independence from Henry, Elizabeth found herself alone with Circus Baby. The animatronic was everything she had hoped for, beautiful and friendly, offering her ice cream with a mechanical arm that extended from her torso. Elizabeth approached, excited and unafraid, reaching for the treat that Circus Baby offered. The claw mechanism activated with mechanical precision, grabbing Elizabeth and pulling her inside the animatronic's body cavity before she could even scream. The death was instantaneous, her small body crushed and absorbed into the machinery, her remnant, her essence, immediately binding to the circuits and endoskeleton of Circus Baby. When William found his daughter, or rather found the animatronic that had consumed her, Circus Baby's eyes had changed. They moved differently, tracked with awareness that programming shouldn't have provided. Elizabeth was inside, her consciousness merged with the machine, trapped in a metal prison of her father's design. William's reaction was complex, grief mixed with scientific curiosity, the loss of his daughter tempered by the confirmation of his theories about remnant. She was gone, but she was also still present, a ghost in the machine, proving that death was not an ending but a transformation. Circus Baby's Pizza World was shut down immediately, the grand opening canceled, the animatronics placed in underground storage where William could access them for his experiments without public scrutiny. With 2 of his 3 children now dead, William's family was disintegrating. His wife, unable to cope with the loss of both Elizabeth and the crying child, either left or died, her fate ambiguous in the historical record. Michael remained the eldest son, now bearing not only his father's neglect, but also the weight of his own guilt and the absence of his siblings. William, for his part, seemed to retreat further into his work, his experiments, his obsessions. If he grieved, he did so privately, allowing nothing to interrupt his pursuit of remnant and the secrets of life after death. It was during this period, with his family broken and his partnership with Henry strained, that William Afton committed his first confirmed murders outside his own family. The exact timeline is contested, but most evidence points to 1985 as the year when William donned the spring Bonnie costume and lured 5 children to their deaths in what would become known as the Missing Children Incident. Their names were Gabriel, Fritz, Susie, Jeremy, and Cassidy, children who had come to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza for parties and fun, unaware that a predator in a yellow rabbit suit was watching, waiting, planning. William was patient, choosing his moments carefully, exploiting gaps in adult supervision, leading children one by one to a back room where no cameras could see, where no one would hear their cries. What he did to them in those moments before death is mercifully left to imagination. But the result was clear. 5 children murdered, their bodies hidden within the animatronic suits, stuffed into Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and a 5th animatronic, their remnant seeping into the machinery, binding their souls to the metal shells. The animatronics began to move strangely after this, their eyes following people when they shouldn't, their performances taking on an aggressive edge, fluid leaking from their suits that staff learned not to investigate too closely. The missing children incident was investigated, parents desperate for answers, police searching for evidence. But William had been careful. There were no witnesses, no proof, only speculation and a security guard, a man later fired, who had been seen acting suspiciously, but against whom no charges could be proven. William Afton watched the investigation from the sidelines, his British accent explaining things to authorities with perfect calm, his position as co-owner of Freddy Fazbear's giving him access to crime scenes and evidence, allowing him to subtly guide the investigation away from any real answers. The case went cold, officially unsolved, though the stain it left on Freddy Fazbear's Pizza's reputation would never fully fade. Henry, Emily, unaware that his partner was the killer, began to suspect that something was deeply wrong with the animatronics. They moved at night, the night guards reported, wandering the halls as if searching for something, their behavior impossible to explain through programming alone. The smell coming from the suits grew worse, a rotting odor that no amount of cleaning could eliminate. Children complained that the animatronics stared at them, followed them, even though they were supposedly powered down. Henry's creation, meant to bring joy, had become something else, something wrong, and he couldn't understand why. His frustration and confusion drove a deeper wedge between him and William, the partnership crumbling as secrets and suspicions accumulated. But William wasn't finished. His experiments with Remnant were yielding results, proof that consciousness could persist after death, that souls could be trapped, harvested, and studied. He built more animatronics in secret, the Funtime series, designed not just to entertain but to capture, to kill, to extract Remnant with mechanical efficiency. Funtime Freddy, with his hand puppet Bonbon, had internal storage compartments. Funtime Foxy's sleek design hid razor-sharp components. Ballora, elegant and graceful, could lure adults as easily as the others lured children. And Circus Baby, containing Elizabeth, served as a centerpiece of his collection, a proof of concept that Remnant could sustain consciousness indefinitely. These animatronics were rented out, sent to birthday parties and private events through a subsidiary company, Afton Robotics, allowing William to continue his harvest without attracting the same attention that another incident at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza would draw. Children disappeared, one here, one there, spread across enough time and location that no pattern was immediately visible. William was building an army of haunted machines, each containing fragments of the children he had killed, their agony and fear fueling his research into immortality and the persistence of consciousness beyond death. Yet, even as William accumulated victims and data, he made a critical error, one born of arrogance or perhaps sentiment. Charlie Emily, Henry's daughter, had always been special, the inspiration behind everything Henry created, the princess of the Freddy Fazbear Empire. William watched her, observed her, and decided that she, too, would become part of his experiment. On a rainy night in 1983, or perhaps 1985, the timeline unclear, William waited outside Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, wearing his civilian clothes rather than the spring Bonnie costume, driving a purple car that would become infamous in witness reports. When Charlie stepped outside, locked out of the building by other children during a party, William acted quickly, killing her in the alley beside the restaurant, her small body left in the rain. But Charlie didn't stay dead, not entirely. The security puppet, an animatronic Henry had, built to watch over his daughter, found her body, draped itself over her, and, in doing so, absorbed her remnant. Charlie became the puppet, the marionette, an entity more aware and more purposeful than the other haunted animatronics. She remembered what had happened to her, remembered William's face, and she was angry. The puppet would become William's most persistent adversary, working against him across decades, helping other trapped souls, keeping them together, ensuring that William's crime would eventually be answered. Henry discovered his daughter's death and was destroyed by it. His partnership with William ended. His involvement with Freddy Fazbear's Pizza ceased, and he retreated from public life to grieve in private. William, meanwhile, continued operating the restaurants, continued his experiments, continued killing, his body count rising as his family fell apart. Michael, now old enough to understand at least some of what his father was doing, began to ask questions, to notice things, to suspect that William Afton was not the man he pretended to be. The tension between father and son grew, Michael's guilt over his brother's death mixing with horror at his father's actions, creating a volatile combination that would eventually explode. The years passed. More children disappeared. More animatronics became haunted, and Freddy Fazbear's Pizza's reputation continued to decline despite cover-ups and rebranding efforts. The Bite of '87, another incident where an animatronic attacked a victim, led to stricter regulations, to animatronics that could no longer walk around during the day, confined to the stage except during performances. William adapted to each setback, finding new ways to access victims, new methods to avoid detection, his British accent and charming demeanor disarming suspicion time and again. He was a family man, a businessman, a talented engineer, surely not capable of the terrible things that people whispered about in connection with Freddy Fazbear's pizza. But the animatronics knew. The children trapped inside them knew, and they were getting angrier, more active, more determined to find the man who had killed them. They wandered at night, searching the building, checking every room, every hallway, every office. Night guards hired to watch the establishment rarely lasted more than a week, driven away by malfunctioning animatronics that seemed intent on finding them, on catching them, on stuffing them into spare suits in the back room. The company, desperate to keep employees, began hiring through temp agencies, offering pitiful wages for what had become one of the most dangerous jobs in Hurricane, Utah. William watched all of this unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. His experiments were successful, remnant was real, consciousness persisted after death, but the side effect was that his victims were becoming increasingly hostile and increasingly capable of threatening him. The animatronics recognized him on some level, even when he wasn't wearing the spring Bonnie costume, their behavior changing when he was near, becoming more aggressive, more focused. He began to fear them. The very machines he had created and filled with the souls of murdered children were now hunting him. And William Afton, for all his brilliance, was still mortal, still vulnerable to the same metal hands and sharp teeth that had killed his own son years before. Reflect on William Afton in these years, a man who had lost his family, his partnership, his humanity, all in pursuit of something he called scientific progress, but which looked increasingly like madness. He had killed at least 11 children, possibly more, had built animatronics specifically designed to murder, had turned entertainment venues into hunting grounds, and had done it all with a calm smile and a British accent that made him seem trustworthy. He was a monster wearing a human mask, and that mask was beginning to slip, the seams showing, the facade cracking under the weight of his crimes, and the restless souls demanding justice. The stage was set for William Afton's first death, though he didn't know it yet. The animatronics were closing in, drawn by something beyond programming, guided by the puppet perhaps, or simply driven by the collective rage of murdered children seeking their killer. William had created machines that could not rest, that could not forget, that would pursue him forever if necessary. And forever, as William would discover, was a very long time. Part 2. The First Death. Springtrap is Born. The year was sometime in the early 1990s, though the exact date remains uncertain, when William Afton returned to the abandoned Freddy Fazbear's pizza location for what he believed would be a routine visit. The restaurant had been closed for years, left to decay after yet another incident had finally forced the company to shut down this particular location. The building stood empty, its arcade machines dark, its party rooms silent, its stage vacant except for the animatronics that remained, powered down but somehow still present, still waiting. William entered through a back door, his key still working despite the years that had passed. He had come to dismantle the animatronics, to retrieve the remnant he had stored within them, to salvage what he could from the failed experiment that was Freddy Fazbear's pizza, before the building was demolished or sold. He carried tools, preparation for the physical work of disassembling the mechanical endoskeletons, extracting the circuit boards, recovering the remnant that made these machines more than simple robots. He was methodical as always, efficient, moving through the building with the confidence of someone who had built these things and knew every bolt, every wire, every hidden mechanism. But William was not alone in the building. The animatronics, though powered down, were not truly inactive. The souls inside them, Gabriel, Fritz, Susie, Jeremy, and Cassidy, along with Charlie inhabiting the puppet, had been waiting for this moment, waiting for William to return, waiting for their chance. When he approached the first animatronic, perhaps Freddy himself, and began to dismantle it, something unexpected happened. The machinery shuddered, sparked, and the soul inside was released, freed from the metal prison that had held it for years. A ghostly figure appeared, translucent and flickering, the image of a child standing before their murderer. William stumbled backward, shocked not by fear but by scientific impossibility. The remnant should have kept the soul bound to the animatronic, trapped there indefinitely. Its release suggested his theories were incomplete, that there were variables he hadn't accounted for. He moved to the next animatronic, dismantling it as well, and again a spirit emerged, freed by the destruction of its vessel. One by one, William released the souls he had trapped, each disassembly bringing forth another ghost, another murdered child now standing in the decaying pizzeria, watching him with hollow eyes. 5 spirits surrounded William Afton, the children he had killed years before, now manifest as something between memory and presence. They didn't speak, didn't need to, their accusation clear in their very existence. William backed away, his scientific curiosity overridden by a more primal emotion, the realization that he was cornered, that the children he had murdered were somehow still here, still angry, still capable of acting against him. He turned and ran, his composure finally breaking, fleeing through the building he knew so well, searching for an exit, for safety, for anywhere these spirits couldn't follow. But the children pursued him, phasing through walls, appearing in doorways, cutting off his escape routes, herding him deeper into the building. William's breath came in gasps, his mind racing through options, through possibilities, through ways to survive what seemed increasingly like a supernatural attack. He burst into the safe room, a hidden area not visible on any floor plan, a place where the spring animatronic suits were stored, relics from Fredbear's family diner that had been retired years ago after too many Springlock failures. The Spring Bonnie suit stood in the corner, yellow and decayed, its mechanisms rusted but still functional, or so William hoped. The spirits entered the safe room, closing in on William, their presence filling the small space with a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. William made his decision in that moment, driven by panic or perhaps by a desperate plan. He knew the Spring Bonnie suit, had worn it dozens of times, had used it to lure children to their deaths. If he could get inside it, perhaps the spirits wouldn't recognize him. Perhaps they would see only the character they had once trusted. Perhaps he could hide within the very disguise he had used to murder them. His hands shook as he opened the suit, as he stepped inside the hollow cavity where so many times before he had stood safely. The building's roof had been leaking for years, rain seeping through broken tiles, pooling in corners, dripping down walls. The safe room was damp, moisture in the air, condensation on metal surfaces. William, in his panic, didn't notice or didn't care, climbing fully into the Spring Bonnie suit, feeling the spring locks around him, hundreds of them holding back the animatronic components. He reached for the hand mechanisms, for the headpiece, sealing himself inside, and for a moment he thought he had succeeded, thought he was safe inside his yellow rabbit disguise. Then, a single drop of water fell from the ceiling, landing on the suit's shoulder. The moisture touched a spring lock, and in an instant, years of rust and mechanical stress reached their breaking point. The lock failed, snapping closed with tremendous force, and like a cascade, one failure triggered the next, and the next, and the next. All around William's body, the spring locks released simultaneously, driving animatronic parts into his flesh, crossbeams through his torso, gears into his organs, the suette's internal mechanisms collapsing inward like a metal coffin designed to crush and pierce from every angle. William screamed, a sound that echoed through the empty building, through the safe room where the spirits watched, through the decades that would follow. Blood poured from the suit, pooling on the floor, seeping into circuits and wiring. The pain was beyond anything he had ever imagined, beyond what human consciousness was designed to process, every nerve ending firing at once as metal tore through muscle and bone. His lungs were punctured, making each breath a gurgling struggle. His spine was severed in multiple places. His organs were shredded. By all rights, by all natural law, William Afton should have died within seconds, bled out within minutes, his body too damaged to sustain life. But William did not die, not completely. The very remnant he had been collecting, the essence he had extracted from his victims and stored within the animatronics, was present in this room, soaked into the spring Bonnie suit itself from years of use. As William's blood mixed with the animatronic components, as his consciousness began to fade, that remnant activated, binding his soul to the suit just as it had bound the children's souls to their metal prisons. William Afton, dying inside the spring Bonnie costume, became something new, something that had never existed before, a human consciousness trapped in an animatronic body, kept alive by the same force he had spent years studying, his agony and rage feeding into the remnant, creating a loop that sustained him indefinitely. The spirits of the children watched as William stopped screaming, as his movements stilled, as the spring Bonnie suit stood upright on its own, no longer simply a costume but something alive, something animated by more than mechanics. They had their revenge, or so it seemed. Their murderer was dead, or as close to dead as made no difference, trapped in eternal torment inside the suit he had used to kill them. The spirits faded, their purpose fulfilled or perhaps simply exhausted, leaving the safe room empty except for the spring Bonnie suit that now contained William Afton's consciousness, his body slowly decaying within the metal shell, his mind trapped in a prison of his own design. Years passed. The building was sealed, the safe room hidden behind a false wall when Fazbear Entertainment finally demolished most of the location, unaware that anything remained inside. William stood in darkness, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to die. His consciousness flickered in and out, experiencing time in fragments, moments of awareness separated by voids of nothing. He was alone with his thoughts, with his memories, with the pain that never fully receded, just as the children he had killed had been alone, trapped, unable to escape the animatronics that had become their tombs. The irony was not lost on William, though he had no capacity to appreciate it. no ability to reflect on the poetic justice of his situation. 30 years would pass before anyone found him. 30 years of standing in that dark room, of slow decay, of circuits corroding and flesh mummifying within the suit. William Afton's transformation into Springtrap, as he would come to be known, was a gradual process. His human components breaking down while the animatronic parts integrated with his nervous system. His bones fusing with the endoskeleton. His consciousness spreading throughout the suit's circuitry. He became neither fully human nor fully machine, but something in between. A haunted animatronic containing the soul of a murderer, kept alive by remnant and rage, unable to truly live but equally unable to truly die. The safe room preserved him in its sealed darkness, the humidity and decay actually helping to sustain the remnant that kept him conscious. Mold grew on the suit. Bacteria consumed his decomposing flesh, but the core of what made him William Afton persisted, his memories intact, his personality unchanged, his obsession with remnant and immortality now vindicated in the worst possible way. He had achieved what he sought, existence beyond death, consciousness that persisted despite the destruction of his body, but the cost was an eternity trapped in metal and darkness, a living death that stretched on without end. During those 30 years, the world outside continued. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza closed and reopened in various forms, each iteration bringing new horror, new victims, new haunted animatronics. Michael Afton, William's son, began his long journey to undo his father's crimes, taking jobs at various Fazbear locations, burning with guilt and determination. Henry Emily, racked with sorrow over Charlie's death and the failure of his creations, planned a final solution to end the nightmare that Freddy Fazbear's had become. And the spirits of the children William had murdered, now freed from their animatronic prisons but not yet at rest, wandered in whatever space exists between life and death, waiting for true resolution, for justice, for peace. William, in his darkness, was aware of none of this. His consciousness ebbed and flowed, sometimes aware enough to remember who he was, other times reduced to basic impulses, the hunger for remnant, the desire to continue existing, the rage at being trapped. He couldn't know that his legend was growing, that he had become the boogeyman of Freddy Fazbear's history, the man in the spring Bonnie suit who had murdered children and disappeared, his fate unknown, his crimes unsolved. The truth, that he was sealed inside a wall mere feet from where investigators had searched, would have amused him if he'd been capable of amusement in his current state. Then, in 2023 or thereabouts, 30 years after the murders and William's presumed death, someone bought the abandoned building that had once been Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. They planned to create an attraction, a horror experience called Fazbear's Fright, capitalizing on the dark history of the location, on the urban legends of haunted animatronics and murdered children. They wanted authenticity, wanted real artifacts from the original restaurants, and so they sent people to search through the ruins, to find anything that could be salvaged, anything that would add legitimacy to their horror attraction. One of these searchers found the safe room. The false wall had deteriorated over the decades, enough that someone looking carefully could see the seam, could tell that the room extended further than it should. They broke through, shining flashlights into the darkness, and there, standing in the corner, was a decayed yellow animatronic, a rabbit with withered features, its suit torn and moldy, something dark staining its interior. They thought it was perfect, exactly the kind of creepy artifact their attraction needed. They hauled it out, loaded it into a truck, never suspecting that the animatronic was occupied, that inside the rotting costume was what remained of William Afton, his consciousness stirring as light touched him for the first time in 3 decades. William Afton, now fully Springtrap, awakened in the Fazbear's fright attraction. His systems, dormant for years, began to activate, circuits sparking to life, servos whining as they struggled against years of corrosion. He could move again, though every motion was grinding and difficult, his body a combination of decayed flesh and rusted metal. He could see through the suit's eye sockets, his vision flickering and distorted, but functional. He could hear the sounds of construction, of people building the attraction around him. Voices, discussing placement and lighting, and how scary the old rabbit animatronic would be for visitors. Springtrap stood in his designated spot, placed on display like a museum piece, and for the first time in 30 years, William Afton was aware of the world around him. He was no longer trapped in darkness, no longer isolated in the safe room, and this realization brought with it a terrible clarity. He was still alive, still conscious, still capable of action. He had survived his death, had persisted beyond what should have been the end, and now he was free, or as free as something in his condition could be. The hunger that had driven him before, the obsession with remnant and immortality, returned in full force. He was incomplete, damaged, but he was mobile, and that meant he could continue his work, could continue his experiments, could find more victims, more remnant, more ways to cheat death and extend his existence. The Fazbear's fright attraction opened to the public, and Springtrap quickly proved to be more than a simple prop. He moved at night, wandering the halls, appearing in rooms where he shouldn't be. His presence captured on security cameras that showed him staring directly into the lens with eyes that seemed too aware, too intelligent for a machine. The night guard hired to watch the attraction found himself hunted. Springtrap appearing in doorways, in vents, in the office itself, moving with clear intent, with purpose, trying to reach the guard for reasons that had nothing to do with programming, and everything to do with the murderous consciousness inside the suit. William Afton was killing again, or trying to, his methods hampered by his damaged body, but his intent unchanged. The night guard survived the week through luck and ventilation systems that could temporarily divert Springtrap's attention, but the attraction was clearly dangerous, clearly housing something that was actively malevolent. Then, on the final night of that week, something happened that changed everything. A fire broke out, flames spreading rapidly through the attraction, consuming the decades-old memorabilia, the dry wood, the accumulated debris. The building became an inferno, and Springtrap, caught inside, burned. Fire is one of the few things that can truly destroy remnant, that can break the bond between soul and metal, that can release spirits from their haunted prisons. As Fazbear's fright burned around him, William Afton should have finally died, should have been released from the spring Bonnie suit, should have faced whatever judgment awaits murderers in the afterlife. But William Afton did not burn completely. He crawled through the flames, his suit blackened and charred, his body further damaged but his core consciousness intact. And he escaped into the night, a burning rabbit stumbling away from the collapsing building, refusing to accept death even as fire consumed everything around him. The fire at Fazbear's Fright was attributed to faulty wiring, to old electrical systems in a building that should never have been reopened. The ruins were bulldozed, the land cleared, and the horror attraction became another footnote in the history of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, another failed attempt to capitalize on tragedy. But Springtrap survived, William Afton survived, and he disappeared into the shadows of Hurricane Utah, a charred and broken thing driven by hunger and rage, no longer even pretending to be human, no longer capable of blending into society, reduced to a monster that could only hide and hunt and continue its miserable existence in the margins of the world. Reflect on this transformation, on what William Afton had become. He had sought immortality and achieved it in the worst possible way. His body destroyed, his humanity stripped away, his existence reduced to pain and hunger, and the desperate need to continue existing despite all natural law saying he should stop. He was Springtrap now, the man in the suit who could never take the suit off, who could never die, who could never rest, trapped forever in the consequences of his own actions, hunted by the spirits of his victims, feared by the living, a cautionary tale made flesh and metal about the dangers of trying to cheat death. Yet, even in this state, William Afton refused to give up, refused to accept defeat, refused to simply lie down and let entropy take him. He was, if nothing else, persistent, and that persistence would carry him through fires and destruction, through decades of suffering, through every attempt to finally end what should have ended long ago. William Afton always came back. That was his curse, his punishment, and his defining characteristic. He always came back. Part 3. The Final Attempt, from Scraptrap to Glitchtrap. The years following the Fazbear's Fright fire were difficult for William Afton, though difficult is perhaps an inadequate word for the existence of something that should not exist at all. Springtrap, charred and damaged, lurked in the abandoned corners of Hurricane Utah, avoiding detection, hiding from those few who might recognize him for what he was. His suit was falling apart, the fire having destroyed much of the costume's exterior, leaving exposed endoskeleton, visible wiring, his own mummified corpse showing through gaps in the metal. He was more obviously a corpse now, less disguisable, more clearly something wrong, something that violated natural law. But William was nothing if not adaptable. He found new parts, scavenging from junkyards and abandoned buildings, attaching whatever pieces he could to replace what the fire had taken. His right arm, too damaged to function, was replaced with a crude mechanical limb salvaged from some other animatronic. His skull, exposed when the suit's head casing burned away, was covered with a makeshift mask crafted from spare costume pieces. He became a patchwork thing, a walking corpse held together by determination and remnant. His appearance now closer to Scraptrap, a name that reflected both his damaged state and his refusal to simply fall apart. During this time, William learned that he was not alone in his supernatural existence. Other remnant-infected animatronics had survived, including Circus Baby, still containing his daughter Elizabeth's consciousness, though warped and twisted by years of being trapped in metal. The puppet, containing Charlie Emily, persisted as well, still trying to help the spirits of the children find peace. And Molten Freddy, an amalgamation of the Funtime animatronics fused together, contained multiple souls, multiple murdered children, all of them angry, all of them seeking resolution. These remnant-infused animatronics wandered through Hurricane, drawn to each other by forces they didn't fully understand, existing in a twilight state between life and death, unable to move on, unable to rest. William observed them when he could, cataloging their behavior, noting how remnant manifested in different ways depending on the host body, the strength of the soul's emotions, the circumstances of death. Even in his current state, even as Scraptrap, William Afton was still a scientist at heart, still curious, still driven to understand the forces he had unleashed. Then came the invitation. A new Freddy Fazbear's pizza location was opening, seeking animatronic performers for a unique concept, a place where customers could experience the authentic Fazbear experience while also celebrating the franchise's storied history. The advertisement was careful, specific, calling for particular types of animatronics, offering generous compensation for those who appeared for an interview. William, reading the advertisement in a newspaper left in an alley, recognized it immediately for what it was, a trap. But a trap set by whom, and for what purpose? Henry Emily, it turned out, had not been idle during the years since his daughter's death. He had been planning, designing, creating one final attraction that would serve not to entertain, but to destroy. This new pizzeria simulator, as he called it, was a carefully constructed death trap, designed to lure in all the remnant-infected animatronics, all the haunted machines that carried the souls of murdered children, and William Afton himself, if he was still somehow alive. Henry had built a location that could be sealed, that could be heated to temperatures high enough to destroy remnant permanently, that could finally end the nightmare that had started with his partnership with William so many years ago. Michael Afton, William's son, understood his role in Henry's plan. He was to manage the pizzeria, to conduct salvage interviews with the animatronics that appeared, to keep them all in the building until Henry was ready to spring the trap. Michael had spent years trying to undo his father's crimes, working as a night guard at various locations, surviving attacks from haunted animatronics, gradually piecing together the full scope of what William had done. He had scooped by Circus Baby's crew and had his organs removed, had been used as a skin suit by the animatronics trying to escape their underground facility, and had somehow survived that as well. His body kept functioning by remnant, even as it decayed, becoming purple and corpse-like, a walking dead man driven by guilt and duty. Father and son, both undead in their own ways, both driven by obsessions that wouldn't let them rest, were about to face each other in a burning building designed to end everything. But neither knew the other was there, not yet. William, as Scraptrap, appeared in the back alley of the new pizzeria on a Wednesday night, drawn by the advertisement, curious despite his suspicions. Michael, sitting in the office, saw him on the monitor, saw the decayed rabbit animatronic approaching the building, and initiated the salvage protocol. A voice, pre-recorded instructions, guided Michael through the process of testing the animatronic, of determining whether it was valuable enough to keep or too dangerous to allow inside. The questions were absurd, given the circumstances, asking Michael to approach the obviously haunted animatronic, to poke it with a controlled shock, to document its responses. Springtrap sat in the alley, immobilized by some mechanism Michael had activated, forced to endure the evaluation. Through the Suet's audio systems, through circuits that barely functioned, William could hear the questions being asked, could hear the voice conducting the interview, and something about that voice was familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. Michael, looking at Springtrap on the monitor, at the charred and decayed rabbit suit, wondered if his father could possibly be inside that thing. If William Afton had somehow survived for 3 decades inside a springlock suit, if the monster he was salvaging was the man who had destroyed their family. The salvage was completed successfully, and Springtrap was brought inside the pizzeria, placed in a back room where he could be stored until needed. Over the following week, other animatronics arrived and were salvaged. Molten Freddy, a tangle of wires and hatred. Scrap Baby, Elizabeth Afton, twisted by years of isolation and resentment toward her father for building her prison. And the puppet, contained within a new animatronic called Lefty, designed specifically to capture and hold her. All the pieces of Henry's plan were falling into place. All the remnant infected animatronics gathered in one location, all ready to be destroyed in one final purge. Michael ran the pizzeria during the day, a decrepit establishment that barely functioned, serving pizza to children who had no idea they were eating in a death trap. At night, he defended himself against the animatronics as they roamed the building, their aggression increasing as the week progressed, as if they sensed something was coming, as if they knew this was the end. Springtrap was among them, crawling through the ventilation system, appearing in hallways, his movements slow but determined, driven by the need to reach the office, to kill the night guard, to continue the pattern of behavior that had defined his existence for so long. On the final night, Saturday, Michael prepared to complete his shift, knowing that once he did, Henry's plan would activate, the building would lock down, and fire would consume everything inside. Henry's voice came over the intercom, addressing each of the animatronics in turn, explaining why they were here, what had happened to them, offering them peace at last. He spoke to his daughter, to Charlie, telling her she could rest now, that the burden of helping the other souls was lifted, that she had done enough. He spoke to Elizabeth, trapped in Scrap Baby, apologizing for not protecting her, for allowing William to build the machine that killed her. He spoke to the children in Molten Freddy, telling them they had been brave, that their suffering was almost over. And then Henry addressed William directly, though he didn't use his name, didn't need to. "And to you, my old friend," Henry said, his voice carrying decades of sorrow and rage, "I knew you couldn't be content to simply disappear, not my friend. I have a place for you, all of you. This place will not be remembered, and the memory of everything that started this can finally begin to fade away. You don't even realize that you are trapped. Your lust for blood has driven you in endless circles, chasing the cries of children in some unseen chamber always seeming so near, yet somehow out of reach. But you will never find them. None of you will. This is where your story ends." William, hearing these words, understood at last where he was, understood that Henry had orchestrated all of this, had created a trap specifically to destroy him and everything he had created. Fury erupted in what remained of his consciousness, rage at being outsmarted, at being cornered, at losing after surviving for so long. He tried to reach the office, tried to reach Michael, whom he now suspected was his own son. Tried to escape the building before the fire started, but it was too late. The exit was blocked, the ventilation sealed, and the temperature in the building began to rise as Henry activated the building's heating systems, pushing them far beyond safe levels, turning the pizzeria into an oven. Michael sat in the office as flames erupted around him, as the building's structure began to fail, as smoke filled the air. He could have escaped, should have escaped, but he chose to stay to ensure that the animatronics couldn't flee, to guarantee that his father would finally be destroyed. Henry had given him an out, had told him to leave if he wanted to, but Michael rejected it, accepting that his own undead existence was as much an abomination as the others, that he too deserved to burn for his sins, for killing his brother, for not stopping his father sooner, for every failure and mistake that had led to this moment. The fire raged for hours, consuming the building down to its foundation, temperatures reaching levels high enough to melt metal, to destroy remnant, to finally release the souls that had been trapped for so long. Springtrap burned. William Afton burned. The suit and the corpse and the consciousness all consumed by flames that refused to leave anything behind. He screamed, his audio systems failing, his circuits melting, his endoskeleton collapsing, everything he had been and everything he had become reduced to slag and ash. The children's spirits, freed at last, moved on to whatever comes after. Their long nightmare finally ended. Or so it seemed. The building collapsed in on itself, a funeral pyre that erased Freddy Fazbear's pizza from the physical world, leaving only a cleared lot and memories that Henry hoped would fade. The company, Fazbear Entertainment, declared bankruptcy, its assets liquidated, its legacy one of tragedy and horror. The animatronics, all of them, were presumably destroyed in the fire, including Springtrap, including William Afton. The nightmare was over. The curse was lifted. The dead could rest. But William Afton did not rest. Somewhere in the digital ether, in the space between circuits and code, something that had been William persisted. His consciousness, having existed in an animatronic form for so long, having integrated with computer systems and circuit boards, had learned to exist in ways that were no longer purely physical. When the fire destroyed his body, when it burned away Springtrap and released his remnant, a fragment of William Afton's consciousness remained, not as a physical presence but as data, as corrupted code, as a virus lurking in the charred remains of the animatronics' circuit boards. Years later, when Fazbear Entertainment was resurrected under new management, when they hired an indie game developer to create virtual reality training programs, when they scanned old circuit boards from the previous locations to capture authentic animatronic behavior, they inadvertently scanned the boards that contained William Afton's digital remnant. They uploaded him into the VR game, giving him form again, this time as Glitchtrap, a golden rabbit that existed in cyberspace, capable of influencing anyone who wore the VR headset, capable of spreading like a virus from system to system, from mind to mind. William Afton, reborn as Glitchtrap, found himself in a new world, a digital landscape where physical laws no longer applied, where he could exist in multiple places simultaneously, where death was no longer even a theoretical concern. He was code now, self-replicating and adaptive, able to hide in any system connected to the Internet, able to possess anyone who interacted with his programming for long enough. The VR game, the Freddy Fazbear virtual experience, became his gateway, his means of spreading beyond the confines of the game, of finding new hosts, new bodies, new ways to continue existing. He found a particularly susceptible host in Vanessa, a beta tester for the game. A young woman whose mind he could infiltrate, whose consciousness he could suppress, transforming her into Vanny, his reluctant follower, his puppet, his means of enacting physical actions in the real world. Through Vanny, William could kill again, could continue his experiments with Remnant, could begin rebuilding everything that had been destroyed in the fire. He was adapting, evolving, learning to exist in new forms, refusing to accept death even when it came in the form of complete physical destruction. Glitchtrap represented William Afton at his most dangerous, no longer constrained by a physical body, no longer vulnerable to fire or spring locks or any physical damage. He was a consciousness that could spread infinitely, that could back itself up, that could exist in every computer system in the world if given enough time. The man who had sought immortality had achieved it in a form he never anticipated, his cruelty and obsession preserved as digital code, his crimes able to be committed by proxy through those he corrupted, his presence a contamination in the very systems meant to teach people about the horrors of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. But even as Glitchtrap, William Afton was not content. He wanted a physical form again, wanted to be more than code, wanted to rebuild his empire of haunted animatronics and remnant research. Through Vanny, he began to work toward resurrection, toward constructing a new body that could house his consciousness, toward returning to the physical world as something more permanent than a digital ghost. The construction of the Pizzaplex, a massive entertainment complex built on the ruins of the old locations, provided the perfect opportunity. In its depths, in the ruins of the old Freddy Fazbear's Pizza that lay beneath the new construction, William's remnant still lingered, still called to him, still offered a pathway back to physical existence. And so William Afton, in his latest form, began to claw his way back into reality, assembling parts, gathering remnant, constructing a new body from the ashes of his old one. He became Springtrap, a skeletal figure barely recognizable as human or animatronic, more like a collection of charred bones and metal held together by will and remnant, his face a skull, his body a nightmare of exposed wiring and scorched endoskeleton. He was buried in the ruins beneath the Pizzaplex, connected to its systems through cables and wires, able to control the facility's security, able to influence the animatronics, able to continue his work even in this barely functional form. Reflect on William Afton's journey from man to monster to digital virus to barely corporeal remnant, his refusal to die becoming almost admirable in its persistence if it weren't so horrifying in its implications. He had become the very thing he studied, a consciousness trapped and sustained by remnant, unable to move on, unable to rest, driven by obsessions that transcended physical death. He was proof that his theories were correct, that consciousness could persist indefinitely, that death was not an ending, but his existence was also proof that such persistence was not a gift but a curse, an eternal imprisonment in states of being that grew progressively worse, progressively more divorced from anything that could be called life. As you drift toward sleep, consider the tragedy of William Afton, a man who achieved everything he sought and found only suffering in his success. His immortality was torture. His persistence was agony. His scientific curiosity led him to become his own experiment, trapped in forms that should not exist, hunted by the spirits of those he killed, burning and rebuilding and burning again in an endless cycle that seemed to have no conclusion. He always came back, yes, but each return was a diminishment, each new form more horrific than the last, each iteration bringing him further from humanity and closer to something else entirely, something that existed only to continue existing, a hollow purpose that defined his entire post-death experience. Let the weight of this story settle over you like a blanket. The darkness of William Afton's tale paradoxically comforting in its completeness, in its exhaustive documentation of how a man can lose everything including himself in pursuit of something he should never have sought. Sleep now, knowing that even the worst monsters began as people, that even William Afton was once simply a man with a family and a dream, before choices and obsessions transformed him into the thing in the suit, the thing in the code, the thing that always comes back. Rest easy, for you are not William Afton. You are not trapped in metal or data. You are simply here, listening, allowing this tale to carry you gently towards sleep, where nightmares are temporary and morning always comes. Part 4. The Psychology and Motivations, Understanding the Monster. Continuing with the second half of the script, revisiting the lore with different emphasis and deeper psychological exploration. Welcome back to the depths of William Afton's story. As we settle into this second journey through his lore, let the familiar details wash over you with new understanding, exploring not just what William did, but why, examining the motivations and psychology of a man who became a monster. Whether you're drifting in and out of sleep or listening with quiet focus, this exploration will trace the inner workings of William Afton's mind, the choices that defined him, the obsessions that consumed him, and the legacy he left behind in bloodstains and burned buildings. The question that haunts anyone studying William Afton is simple yet impossible to answer with certainty. Why? Why did a talented engineer with a successful business decide to murder children? What drove him from creativity to cruelty? From building machines that brought joy to using those same machines as tools for killing? The answers, if they can be called that, are fragmented across decades of evidence, witness testimony, and the behavior patterns of the man himself. Some believe William's descent began with the death of his youngest son in 1983, that the bite that crushed the crying child's skull also broke something in William's psyche, transforming grief into obsession, loss into scientific curiosity about death itself. This theory suggests that William, unable to accept his son's death, began experimenting with remnant as a way to understand what had happened, to find some way to preserve consciousness beyond physical death, to perhaps even bring his son back. His first experiments would have been driven by desperation, by a father's refusal to let go. But somewhere along that path, the goal shifted from resurrection to exploration, from love to curiosity, from saving his son to simply understanding the mechanisms of life and death. But this charitable interpretation doesn't fully explain William's actions. He didn't simply experiment on his own family, didn't limit his research to trying to save those he had lost. He actively murdered other people's children, strangers who had done nothing to him, innocent victims lured away from their families and killed in the back rooms of restaurants he owned. This suggests that whatever drove William was darker than grief, more fundamental than loss. He chose to kill, chose to prey on children specifically, chose to use the Spring Bonnie costume that made him trustworthy to his victims. These were deliberate, calculated actions of a predator, not the desperate experiments of a grieving father. Another theory suggests that William was always a psychopath, that his charming exterior and British accent concealed a complete lack of empathy, an inability to see other people as anything more than objects to be used for his purposes. In this interpretation, his partnership with Henry Emily was simply a means to an end, access to facilities and children. His family was a disguise that made him seem normal, and his experiments with Remnant were not driven by any desire to understand death, but simply by curiosity about how far he could push the boundaries of what was possible. He killed because he wanted to, because he enjoyed it on some level, because the suffering of others satisfied something in his psychology that nothing else could reach. The truth, as always, likely lies somewhere between these extremes. William Afton was a complex man, brilliant and broken in equal measure, capable of creating remarkable technology while simultaneously harboring impulses that led him to terrible acts. His relationship with his family was complicated, providing them material comfort while withholding emotional warmth, suggesting someone who understood the forms of fatherhood without feeling its substance. He worked alongside Henry for years, creating Freddy Fazbear's pizza together, yet at some point began using their shared creation as a hunting ground, betraying their partnership in the most fundamental way possible. What is clear is that William became obsessed with Remnant, with the discovery that consciousness could persist after death, that souls could be trapped in animatronic shells, that the boundary between life and death was not as absolute as most people believed. This obsession drove everything he did in the latter part of his life. Every murder carefully planned to maximize the fear and agony that would produce strong remnant. Every animatronic designed not just to entertain but to serve as a vessel for captured souls. Every experiment pushing further into territory that science and ethics said should remain unexplored. Consider William's design of Circus Baby, the animatronic that killed his own daughter. The claw mechanism hidden inside Baby's torso was not an accident or a malfunction, but an intentional feature. Something William built knowing exactly what it would do. He warned Elizabeth to stay away, suggesting he understood the danger, yet he activated the animatronic anyway, allowed it to be in a location where Elizabeth could reach it, created the circumstances for his daughter's death. Whether this was negligence or something more sinister, whether William secretly hoped Elizabeth would approach the animatronic so he could study what happened when remnant from his own family was harvested, remains an open question that casts a dark shadow over every aspect of his character. The Funtime animatronics, William's private creations, reveal even more about his mindset and priorities. These machines were designed with storage compartments inside their torsos, spaces large enough to hold a human child, accessible through mechanisms that could open and close at command. The official purpose of these compartments was never stated, but their function was clear. They were designed to capture and contain victims, allowing the animatronics to kill away from witnesses, to transport bodies without detection, to make children disappear without leaving evidence behind. William had industrialized murder, turned it into a repeatable process, created machines that could kill with mechanical efficiency while he stood back and observed, collected data, and harvested remnant from the results. This level of planning and preparation indicates that William's murders were not crimes of passion or opportunity, but carefully orchestrated research projects. He approached killing the way other scientists approach experiments, with hypotheses to test, variables to control, data to collect. The children he murdered were not people to him, but subjects, sources of remnant that could be extracted and studied, their deaths merely necessary steps in his research. This clinical detachment, this ability to see human beings as raw materials for experimentation, marks William as something beyond a typical murderer, someone whose psychology had diverged so far from normal human empathy that he functioned according to entirely different moral logic. Yet William was not entirely without human emotion. His rage when cornered by the spirits of his victims, his determination to survive when trapped in the spring-lock suit. His efforts to rebuild and continue his work even after being burned to ash all suggest a man driven by powerful emotions, even if those emotions were twisted and destructive. He felt anger, certainly, fury at being thwarted, at being trapped, at failing to achieve his goals. He felt determination, an absolute refusal to give up or accept defeat, a persistence that carried him through decades of suffering that would have broken anyone else. What he seemed to lack was fear of consequences, guilt over his actions, or concern for anyone beyond himself. William's relationship with his children reveals perhaps the clearest window into his psychology. Michael, his eldest, was someone William apparently saw as a disappointment or an inconvenience, someone to be ignored rather than nurtured, someone whose existence seemed to barely register in William's consciousness. This neglect drove Michael to seek his father's attention through increasingly desperate means, culminating in the cruel prank that killed his younger brother, an act that then trapped Michael in a cycle of guilt that consumed the rest of his life. William's response to the crying child's death was apparently minimal. No outward grief, no change in behavior, just a continuation of his work as if nothing significant had happened. Elizabeth, William's daughter, seemed to receive slightly more attention, if only because William built Circus Baby ostensibly for her. Though, as we've discussed, Baby's true purpose was far darker than entertainment. When Elizabeth died, consumed by the animatronic William had created, his reaction was again subdued, scientific interest apparently outweighing paternal grief. He kept Circus Baby in storage, kept Elizabeth trapped in the machine, visited her periodically to observe how her consciousness had integrated with the animatronic, treating his daughter's death as a successful experiment rather than a tragedy to be mourned. This treatment of his own children suggests that William Afton was incapable of love in any conventional sense, that whatever emotions he experienced were muted or channeled into his obsessions, that family was something he maintained because it served purposes of appearing normal, but not something he valued for its own sake. His wife, whose fate remains unclear, either died or left, unable to cope with William's coldness and the deaths of two of her children, and William apparently let her go without much reaction. Another person in his life who exited without leaving a significant impact on his behavior or choices. As Springtrap, William's psychology became even more difficult to parse. Trapped in the suit, in constant pain, his human body decaying while his consciousness persisted through Remnant, he should have been driven mad by the experience, shattered by the isolation and agony of 30 years in darkness. Yet, when he emerged at Fazbear's fright, Springtrap was still William, still capable of hunting, still driven by the same impulses that had defined him in life. The suit hadn't changed his fundamental nature, hadn't redeemed him or taught him remorse. If anything, it had concentrated his essence, distilling William Afton down to his core components: hunger, rage, persistence, and an absolute refusal to accept death or defeat. The transition from Springtrap to Scraptrap showed further deterioration, both physical and perhaps psychological. The fire that burned Fazbear's fright should have ended him, yet William crawled from the flames, rebuilt himself from scrap parts, and continued hunting. This act demonstrated something profound about William's character. He was willing to endure anything, any amount of suffering, any degree of degradation, rather than simply stop existing. Life, even a tortured mockery of it, was preferable to death. Consciousness, even trapped in a metal shell filled with pain, was better than whatever came after. This suggests that William, for all his research into Remnant and the persistence of souls, was deeply afraid of what might happen if he truly died. If his consciousness was released from physical anchors and had to face whatever judgment awaits murderers in the afterlife. The burning at Henry's Pizzeria, the trap that was supposed to end everything, was William's first experience of being completely outmaneuvered by someone who understood him. Henry's plan accounted for William's persistence, his refusal to die, his ability to survive seemingly any injury. By trapping him in a building that reached temperatures high enough to destroy Remnant itself, Henry addressed not just William's physical form, but the supernatural force that kept him alive. The fire was not just punishment, but solution, a way to finally erase William Afton from existence by attacking the fundamental mechanism that sustained him. Yet even this was not enough. William's consciousness, having existed in integrated machine form for so long, had learned to persist in ways that transcended physical existence. His transformation into Glitchtrap represents perhaps the ultimate expression of his refusal to die, his ability to adapt to any circumstance, his determination to continue existing no matter what form that existence takes. As a digital entity, William no longer had to worry about physical death, about fire or spring locks or any material danger. He had become something harder to kill than a ghost, an idea, a corruption, a virus that could spread and replicate indefinitely. Glitchtrap's ability to possess Vanessa, to turn her into Vanny, and use her as a puppet to commit acts in the physical world, shows that William's fundamental nature survived even the transition to digital form. He was still a predator, still manipulative, still willing to destroy others to serve his purposes. The methods had changed, the medium had evolved, but the core of what made William Afton dangerous remained intact. His complete lack of empathy, his willingness to harm anyone, his obsession with continuing his research regardless of cost, and his absolute refusal to simply stop existing. Reflect on the tragedy of William Afton, not from his perspective, but from that of everyone he touched. Henry Emily, his partner, who lost his daughter to William's cruelty and spent the rest of his life trying to undo the damage their partnership had caused. Michael Afton, his son, who grew up without a father's love, killed his brother through cruelty born of that neglect, and then spent decades trying to atone by tracking down and destroying his father's remnant-infected creations. Elizabeth Afton, his daughter, killed by a machine her father built, trapped in metal, transformed from a curious child into something angry and twisted by years of imprisonment. The crying child, William's youngest, who lived in fear and died in agony. His final moments a nightmare of pain and his father's indifference. And, of course, the other victims, the children whose names we know: Gabriel, Fritz, Susie, Jeremy, Cassidy, Charlotte, and those whose names are lost, each one lured by William's charm, by the friendly rabbit suit, by promises of safety or prizes or fun, only to be murdered and stuffed into animatronic suits where their souls would be trapped for decades. The families of these children, the parents who searched desperately for answers that never came, the siblings who grew up without their brothers and sisters, the community of Hurricane, Utah, that lived under a shadow of missing children and unsolved murders for years, all of them damaged by William Afton's actions, all of them casualties of his obsessions. William Afton destroyed everything he touched: his family, his partnership, his business, the lives of countless children, and ultimately himself, transforming through his own actions from a man into a monster, into a digital virus, into barely corporeal remnant. Each transformation a degradation, each new form less human than the last. He sought immortality and achieved eternal suffering, sought understanding and found only more questions, sought power over death and became death's prisoner, unable to truly live but equally unable to die, trapped in an existence that could only be described as hell. As sleep draws nearer, let William Afton's story serve as a meditation on obsession, on what happens when curiosity becomes cruelty, when scientific pursuit abandons ethical constraints, when a person decides that understanding something is worth any cost regardless of who pays it. William was brilliant, certainly. His animatronics were marvels of engineering, his understanding of remnant genuine if twisted, his ability to persist beyond death a kind of terrible success. But brilliance without empathy, knowledge without wisdom, and persistence without purpose create only suffering, only tragedy, only a legacy of pain that echoes long after the person themselves has ceased to be recognizable as human. The man who always came back did so not because he was strong, but because he was empty, hollow at his core, sustained not by love or connection, but by stubborn refusal to accept what should have been inevitable. Each return was weaker, each new form more desperate, each iteration proving that sometimes death is mercy, that endings serve a purpose, that not everything should persist forever. William Afton's story is ultimately one of failure disguised as success, of achieving goals that turned out to be worthless, of surviving when death would have been kinder to him and everyone around him. Rest now in the knowledge that monsters are made, not born, that William Afton's transformation from engineer to murderer was a series of choices, each one taking him further from humanity, each one making the next terrible decision easier. Sleep with the understanding that his tale is a warning, carved in metal and preserved in code, that some knowledge is not worth pursuing, that some boundaries exist for good reason, that death is not an enemy to be defeated, but a natural end that gives meaning to life. Let the weight of William Afton's decades of suffering, his burns and rebuilds and transformations, remind you that the worst prisons are those we build for ourselves, that the heaviest chains are those forged from our own obsessions. William Afton always came back, but each return was to a world that had moved on without him, to a role that had diminished, to an existence that was less like life and more like haunting, a ghost too stubborn to fade, too damaged to heal, too lost to find its way to anything resembling peace. In this, perhaps, lies the greatest tragedy of all, that William achieved exactly what he wanted, persistence beyond death, and found only that such persistence without purpose, without change, without growth, is indistinguishable from damnation. Part 5. The Legacy Echoes Across Decades. Continuing the exploration of William Afton's lasting impact. As we drift further into this exploration of William Afton's lore, let us turn our attention to what he left behind. The ripples spreading from his actions, touching people and places decades after his supposed death, influencing events through remnant and digitally stored consciousness, creating a legacy that refuses to fade. Whether sleep is close now or still distant, allow these final sections to carry you gently through the aftermath of one man's obsession and the weight of consequences that never fully dissipate. William Afton's legacy is written primarily in tragedy and horror, but it extends beyond his immediate victims to encompass the entire Freddy Fazbear franchise, the company that bore his and Henry's vision, that became synonymous with missing children and haunted animatronics, that persisted through bankruptcy and rebirth and closure again, always carrying the stain of William's crimes. Fazbear Entertainment, the corporate entity that controlled Freddy Fazbear's Pizza through its various iterations, spent decades covering up incidents, paying off families, quietly settling lawsuits, doing everything possible to maintain the fiction that their restaurants were safe. Family-friendly establishments rather than hunting grounds where a serial killer had operated with impunity for years. The company's approach to William's crimes reveals a different kind of moral failure. Not the active cruelty of murder, but the passive evil of willful ignorance, of prioritizing profit over truth, of allowing horror to continue because acknowledging it would be expensive and difficult. When children went missing at Freddy Fazbear's locations, the company's response was not to investigate thoroughly, but to minimize, to suggest runaways or custody disputes, to avoid negative publicity at all costs. When animatronics began moving at night, attacking security guards, displaying behavior that no programming could explain, the company blamed mechanical failures, hired temp workers to replace those who quit or disappeared, and continued operating as if nothing unusual was happening. This corporate complicity in William's crimes created an environment where he could kill with minimal risk of exposure, where evidence was destroyed or hidden, where witnesses were discredited or paid off, where the priority was always protecting the brand rather than protecting children. Fazbear Entertainment knew, on some level, that something was terribly wrong with their establishments, that the animatronics contained human remains, that the disappearances were connected to their properties, yet they chose ignorance, chose to look away, chose profit over accountability. In this, they became William's unwitting accomplices, the infrastructure that enabled his crimes to continue across multiple locations and years. The physical locations themselves carry William's mark, each building where he operated becoming a kind of cursed ground, places where violence soaked into foundations and walls, where remnant accumulated in machinery and wiring, where the boundary between the living and dead grew thin enough for spirits to cross. The original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, where the missing children incident occurred, became a place that could never quite be cleansed, no matter how many times it was remodeled or reopened. The animatronics there moved with purpose, searching for something, drawn by the presence of their killer, or perhaps simply by the need to find peace through revenge. Circus Baby's Pizza World, William's private facility where Elizabeth died, never even opened to the public, shut down immediately after the tragedy, its animatronics placed in underground storage where William could access them for experiments. That facility, renamed Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental, became a place where William stored his fun-time animatronics, his murder machines, his experiments in blending consciousness with technology. The underground location, hidden from public view, served as William's laboratory, a place where he could work without oversight, where the sounds of children dying would be muffled by earth and concrete, where he could perfect his remnant extraction techniques without interference. Fazbear's Fright, the horror attraction built on the ruins of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, was an attempt to monetize the tragedy, to turn real horror into entertainment, to profit from the legend of haunted animatronics and missing children. The attraction's owners gathered artifacts from the original locations, from circuit boards to animatronic parts to old promotional materials, unknowingly collecting pieces saturated with remnant, with the emotions and agony of William's victims. When they found Springtrap in the sealed safe room, they thought they'd discovered the perfect centerpiece for their attraction, unaware they'd freed William Afton from his prison, given him mobility again, allowed him to resume his hunting in a new environment designed explicitly to celebrate the horrors he had created. Henry's final pizzeria, the trap designed to destroy all remnant-infected animatronics, was built on deliberate irony. A Freddy Fazbear's Pizza that existed only to end Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. A place that looked like all the others but whose true purpose was cremation, destruction, final closure. Henry's design was meticulous, every detail calculated to lure in the haunted animatronics, to make them feel safe enough to stay, to keep them inside until the fire could be triggered. The location's brief existence, opening and closing within a week, marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. A transition from physical remnant to digital corruption, from haunted metal to infected code. The Mega Pizzaplex, built decades later on the ruins of all these previous locations, represents Fazbear Entertainment's latest attempt to resurrect the franchise, to turn dark history into nostalgic entertainment, to rebuild on literally cursed ground. The massive complex, with its multiple floors and attractions, its Glamrock animatronics and advanced security systems, its corporate cheerfulness concealing the layers of tragedy beneath, embodies everything William's legacy has become. a commercialized horror, a packaged nightmare, a place where real deaths are transformed into lore and entertainment. Beneath the Pizzaplex, in the ruins of the old locations, William exists as Springtrap, connected to the facility's systems, able to influence its operations, still trying to continue his work even in his diminished state. Each of these locations carries William's presence like a stain, his actions soaking into their foundations, his crimes becoming part of their identity, his remnant literally built into their infrastructure. The buildings themselves become characters in his story, accomplices and victims simultaneously, spaces that enabled his cruelty while also suffering from it, places that cannot escape what happened within their walls no matter how many times they're rebuilt or renamed or repurposed. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, in all its iterations, is less a restaurant chain than a phenomenon, a curse that spreads wherever it manifests, bringing with it the weight of William Afton's decades of murder and the supernatural consequences that refuse to dissipate. The animatronics, those that don't contain murder victims' souls, still carry William's influence through their design and programming. He built many of them, particularly the Fun Time series and Circus Baby, with purposes that extended beyond entertainment into capture and killing. Even the original Freddy Fazbear's band, though designed primarily by Henry, were modified and maintained by William, who had access to their endoskeletons and circuitry, who could have altered their programming in subtle ways, who certainly understood their mechanisms well enough to exploit them for his purposes. The animatronics are William's children, in a sense, mechanical offspring that reflect their creator's brilliance and monstrosity in equal measure, capable of bringing joy but also of dealing death, their dual nature mirroring William's own duplicity. The people affected by William extend beyond his immediate victims to encompass everyone who worked at Freddy Fazbear's locations, who investigated the murders, who survived encounters with haunted animatronics, who grew up hearing stories about the missing children and the man in the spring Bonnie suit. Security guards, particularly those brave or desperate enough to work the night shift, faced William's legacy directly, hunted by animatronics that moved with murderous intent, surviving 5 nights or sometimes fewer before quitting or disappearing themselves. These guards, often portrayed as gameplay protagonists, represent ordinary people thrust into extraordinary horror, surviving through cleverness and luck against machines that should not be moving at all. The families of William's victims carry perhaps the heaviest burden of his legacy. Parents who lost children to his murders, who searched for years without answers, who eventually learned their children had been stuffed into animatronic suits and left to rot, who could never get justice because William was already dead, or disappeared, or transformed into something prosecution couldn't address. These families, scattered across the games and books, remain largely anonymous, background figures whose grief is implied rather than explored, but their suffering is no less real for being understated. William destroyed not just individuals, but family units, relationships, futures, leaving behind voids that could never be filled. Michael Afton, William's eldest son, perhaps best embodies the legacy's personal cost. He spent his life trying to undo his father's crimes, hunting down haunted animatronics, working as a security guard at multiple locations despite knowing the danger. eventually allowing himself to burn in Henry's trap because he believed his continued existence was as much an abomination as the things he hunted. Michael's story is one of redemption sought but never fully achieved, of guilt that drives action but cannot be assuaged, of a son forever defined by his father's sins and his own complicity in his brother's death. He became undead, scooped and worn as a skin suit by animatronics trying to escape, his body rotting and purple yet still functioning through remnant, a walking corpse that mirrored his father's existence in Springtrap. Both Aftons transformed into mockeries of life through their involvement with remnant and haunted machines. Elizabeth, William's daughter, transformed from a curious child into something angry and vengeful through her imprisonment in Circus Baby. The girl who once admired her father's work became a creature that resented him, that blamed him for her death and her decades of captivity, that wanted revenge even as she couldn't fully separate herself from the consciousness of Circus Baby herself. Elizabeth's evolution from victim to quasi-antagonist shows how William's influence corrupted even after death, how being touched by his work changed people fundamentally, how innocence could be transformed into malevolence through suffering and time. The crying child, William's youngest, whose name was never revealed, exists in the lore primarily as a tragedy. A boy who feared animatronics and died because of them, whose birthday party became his death scene, whose brother's cruelty intersected with mechanical failure to create a nightmare. Some theories suggest he became the vengeful spirit known as Golden Freddy, or that he possessed the Fredbear animatronic, or that he simply died, and nothing supernatural followed. Regardless of what happened to his consciousness after death, the crying child's short life illustrates William's failure as a father, his inability or unwillingness to comfort his son's fears, his indifference to his child's suffering, his absence even in death. Henry Emily, William's partner and friend, carries a different kind of burden from William's legacy. Henry, created out of love, designed animatronics to bring joy to his daughter and other children, poured his heart into Freddy Fazbear's pizza with genuine good intentions. William's betrayal, his misuse of their shared creations, his murder of Henry's daughter Charlie, shattered Henry's life and work, transforming his legacy from one of innovation and entertainment into one of horror and death. Henry's response, decades of planning culminating in the trap that destroyed all remnant-infected animatronics, shows a man broken by guilt and grief, someone who recognized that his creations had become tools for evil, and who decided the only solution was complete destruction, burning everything including himself to ash to ensure William's work couldn't continue. The lore community, the thousands of people who have spent years analyzing FNAF games and books, piecing together timelines and theories, debating William's motivations and actions, represents another kind of legacy. William Afton has become a cultural phenomenon, a character studied and discussed, feared and mocked, analyzed from every angle. His story has spawned countless interpretations, fan theories, artwork, fiction, video essays, and discussions. He has transcended his original context to become a symbol of various things to different people: persistence, obsession, the dangers of seeking immortality, the corruption of scientific pursuit by cruelty, the banality of evil dressed in a friendly costume. This cultural legacy ensures that William Afton, in some form, will persist far beyond any canonical conclusion to his story. He has become larger than the games that introduced him, a character that lives in collective imagination, that influences other media and discussions about horror, that serves as a reference point for certain types of villains and narratives. In this sense, William achieved a kind of immortality he never anticipated. Not through remnant or digital consciousness, but through story, through becoming a tale told and retold, analyzed and reinterpreted, never quite dying because new people keep discovering him, keep wanting to understand what made him choose murder and persistence over morality and rest. As sleep draws very near now, reflect on the weight of legacy, on how a single person's actions can ripple through decades, affecting hundreds of lives directly and thousands indirectly, creating consequences that outlast the original actor by generations. William Afton's legacy is one of destruction, certainly, but also of revelation, showing what happens when brilliance is divorced from empathy, when curiosity overrides ethics, when obsession with understanding death leads to causing it. His story, tragic and terrible, serves as a kind of moral lesson wrapped in horror, a warning about the human capacity for rationalization, for separating means from ends, for deciding that some goal is worth any cost. Let William's legacy settle around you like the darkness in a closed pizzeria, heavy with the weight of decades, saturated with remnant and memory, a palpable presence that never quite fades, no matter how many times the buildings are torn down and rebuilt. His influence persists in every new FNAF game, every reference to missing children and haunted animatronics, every appearance of a yellow rabbit or a burnt skeletal figure. He is the thread connecting every tragedy, the origin point from which all horror flows, the man whose choices created a cascade of suffering that continues long after his last confirmed appearance. Sleep now with the understanding that legacies are built through actions, that we are remembered not for our intentions but our choices, that William Afton, for all his brilliance and persistence, will be forever known as the man who murdered children and refused to die, whose cruelty echoed through generations, whose presence poisoned everything he touched. His legacy is a warning carved in metal and code, preserved in rumors and documented incidents, a cautionary tale about what happens when a person decides they are entitled to answers, regardless of who must suffer to provide them. Rest in the knowledge that some stories need to be told, not because they're pleasant, but because they're important, because they illustrate truths about human nature that we must understand to guard against. William Afton's story is one of those tales, dark and disturbing, yet necessary in its exploration of how monsters are made and what they leave behind. Part 6. The Endless Return, What Keeps Him Alive. Final section exploring the metaphysical and thematic elements of William's persistence. We arrive now at the heart of William Afton's mystery, the question that defines his entire existence across decades of games and media. Why can't he die? What keeps him coming back when fire should have destroyed him, when remnant should have been exhausted, when every logical endpoint suggests his consciousness should have dissipated into whatever comes after? Let this final exploration carry you gently into sleep, examining not just the mechanics of his persistence but its meaning, its purpose, and what it says about obsession, guilt, and the refusal to accept endings. On a mechanical level, William's persistence is explained through remnant, the supernatural substance born from strong emotion at the moment of death, capable of binding consciousness to physical objects. William discovered or theorized remnant's existence, harvested it through murdering children whose fear and agony produced potent amounts, and injected it into animatronics to study its effects. When he died in the Spring Bonnie suit, surrounded by remnant-soaked machinery, his own consciousness was bound to the suit just as his victims had been bound to their metal prisons. This explains Springtrap, explains how William could survive decades of physical decay, explains his initial persistence beyond death. But Springtrap should have been destroyed at Fazbear's fright. The fire that consumed the horror attraction reached temperatures that should have melted his endoskeleton, destroyed his circuitry, and released his remnant. Yet William escaped, transformed into Scraptrap, rebuilt himself from scrap parts and sheer determination. This suggests that remnant alone doesn't fully explain his persistence, that there's something about William's consciousness specifically, some quality of his personality or will, that makes him harder to destroy than other spirits trapped in similar circumstances. The children he murdered, when freed from their animatronic bodies, moved on to the afterlife. William, when freed, simply found another prison to inhabit, another form to take, another way to continue existing. The fire at Henry's Pizzeria should have been absolutely final. The temperatures reached levels specifically calculated to destroy remnant permanently, to break the bonds between consciousness and matter, to release all trapped spirits, including William. The building collapsed, reducing everything to ash and slag, leaving nothing that could possibly serve as a vessel for William's consciousness. Yet he persisted, transitioning from physical remnant to digital code, from Scraptrap to Glitchtrap, adapting to a new medium of existence because the alternative, true death, was apparently unacceptable to whatever drives William's consciousness at its deepest level. This transition to Glitchtrap reveals something profound about William's nature. His consciousness, having existed in digital systems integrated with animatronic hardware for so long, had learned to think of itself as data, as information that could be stored, transferred, backed up, replicated. When his physical form was destroyed, his consciousness simply migrated to the most available medium, the circuit boards that were later scanned into the VR training program. This suggests that William's persistence is not just about remnant, but about his fundamental understanding of consciousness itself, his belief that identity is information, that death is simply deletion, and that with enough backups and storage, deletion can be avoided indefinitely. But there's another interpretation, darker and more metaphysical, that William Afton cannot die because he won't accept death, that his persistence is not supernatural or technological, but purely a manifestation of will, of refusal, of obsession so strong it overrides natural law. In this reading, remnant and digital consciousness are not the mechanisms keeping William alive, but excuses, explanations created by a narrative that needs to rationalize something fundamentally irrational. A man who simply refuses to stop existing, whose personality is so focused on persistence that death itself cannot convince him to let go. This interpretation aligns with William's characterization across the series. He is defined by stubbornness, by the refusal to accept defeat or limitation, by the determination to continue his experiments regardless of obstacles. His murders were not impulsive crimes of passion, but patient, calculated harvests of remnant, sometimes spanning years between victims, showing someone who could wait, could plan, could persist toward long-term goals despite immediate setbacks. His design and construction of animatronics showed the same patience, the same willingness to work toward distant objectives, to build systems that would serve purposes years after their creation. William was, fundamentally, someone who played long games, who thought in decades rather than days, who built legacies rather than seeking immediate gratification. This mindset, when combined with his discovery of remnant and the realization that consciousness could persist beyond physical death, created a feedback loop. William believed death could be overcome, so he sought ways to overcome it. So he experimented with remnant. So he bound his consciousness to machinery. So he learned to exist in new forms. So he adapted when those forms were destroyed, all of it reinforcing his original belief that death was not an ending, but simply another problem to solve through application of will and intelligence. His persistence became self-fulfilling, each survival reinforcing the worldview that had led him to survive in the first place. The psychological cost of this persistence is rarely explored, but must be staggering. William has existed in forms of constant suffering for decades, trapped in a spring-lock suit with metal piercing his body, burned multiple times, reduced to skeletal remnants, translated into digital code, rebuilt as Springtrap with barely any physical form remaining. Each of these states involves either physical pain or existential horror or both. Yet William continues, apparently unable or unwilling to simply let go and accept whatever comes after. This suggests either incredible strength of will or incredible fear of death, or possibly both, a man so afraid of ending that he'll endure any amount of suffering to continue, even when continuation brings nothing but more suffering. There's a tragic irony in William's quest for immortality. He achieved it, proved that consciousness can persist indefinitely, demonstrated that death is not necessarily final, accomplished everything he set out to do in his research. But his immortality is a curse. Each new form more degraded than the last, each iteration bringing him further from anything that could be called life, each return diminishing him until he's barely recognizable as human or even as intelligent. He persists, yes, but as what? As Springtrap, he's a corpse in a metal shell. As Glitchtrap, he's malware. As Springtrap, he's barely there at all, more remnant than consciousness, more echo than person. His success in overcoming death becomes his ultimate failure, proving that persistence without purpose is just haunting, that existing forever means experiencing degradation forever, that immortality without growth or change or possibility of redemption is indistinguishable from damnation. The religious or moral dimensions of William's inability to die suggest another interpretation, that he's trapped not by remnant but by guilt, not by technology but by justice, unable to move on because his crimes are unresolved, his victims unavenged, his sins unatoned. In this reading, William's persistence is punishment, a hell of his own making where he's forced to continue existing in increasingly terrible forms because his soul is too corrupt to move on to whatever awaits the dead. He burned multiple times, fire traditionally associated with hellfire, with purification, with punishment for sin. Yet the fire never fully destroyed him, never fully cleansed him, suggesting that his corruption runs too deep for any earthly flame to purge. This interpretation aligns with certain religious traditions that suggest the worst sinners are those who refuse to repent, who persist in their crimes even when confronted with consequences, who never acknowledge wrongdoing or seek redemption. William never showed remorse for his murders, never expressed guilt over his children's deaths, never seemed to recognize that his actions were wrong rather than simply tactically unwise. This absolute lack of moral awareness, this inability to feel guilt or seek forgiveness, could itself be what traps him, what prevents his soul from moving on, what condemns him to an eternal existence in degrading forms until he either achieves genuine remorse or is destroyed so completely that even his stubborn consciousness cannot find a way to persist. The spirits of William's victims, particularly the one known as Cassidy, who seems to be the vengeful spirit in Ultimate Custom Night, suggest yet another dimension to his inability to die. That he's being held here, trapped by the hatred and need for revenge of the children he murdered. In UCN, William experiences what appears to be hell, a place where he's repeatedly killed by animatronics, never allowed to truly die, suffering endlessly as punishment for his crimes. Some interpret this as taking place in his mind during the fires, others as a genuine afterlife punishment. But regardless of interpretation, it suggests that William's persistence might not be entirely his choice, that he's trapped as much by his victim's refusal to let him go as by his own refusal to accept death. This creates a kind of stalemate, where William cannot die because Cassidy won't release him, and Cassidy won't release him because William has never shown remorse, never apologized, never acknowledged the suffering he caused. They're locked together in a cycle of violence and revenge that benefits neither, that keeps both trapped, that prevents any real resolution or peace. William's persistence in this interpretation is not his triumph but his punishment, not evidence of his power but proof of his powerlessness, unable to escape the consequences of his actions even through death, because his victims won't allow it, because justice demands more than simple cessation of existence. The practical effect of William's persistence on the broader FNAF narrative is to create a recurring antagonist, a character who can appear in multiple games across different timelines and settings, whose presence ties together disparate storylines and locations. From a storytelling perspective, William always coming back is convenient, providing narrative continuity and a villain whose actions ripple through decades of in-universe history. But it also creates a kind of fatigue, a sense that William's persistence has become less about character and more about franchise maintenance, that his returns grow increasingly contrived because the story needs him present rather than because his presence serves the narrative. This metatextual dimension of William's inability to die reflects perhaps the ultimate irony, that William Afton, the character who seeks immortality and achieves it through horrific means, has become functionally immortal on a different level entirely, as a cultural artifact, a franchise cornerstone, a character who cannot be allowed to permanently die because he's too valuable to the brand, too central to the identity of FNAF as a series. His persistence, then, becomes not just a plot point, but a commentary on franchises themselves, on how stories sometimes cannot end even when they should, on how characters become trapped not by remnant, but by narrative necessity, forced to return again and again long past the point where their story reached natural conclusion. As you drift now toward sleep, imagine William Afton in his various forms, trapped in a cycle he created but cannot escape, persisting because he must, because he will, because something in his psychology or situation or the narrative that contains him prevents any final ending. See him burning and rebuilding, dying and returning, always coming back in diminished form, yet never fully destroyed. A cautionary tale about the dangers of refusing to accept endings, of seeking immortality without understanding its cost, of persisting simply for the sake of persistence without any purpose or goal beyond continuation itself. Let William's eternal return serve as a meditation on obsession, on what happens when a single drive, a single refusal becomes so central to identity that it persists beyond reason, beyond benefit, beyond even consciousness itself, reducing a person to a single impulse repeated endlessly. I will not die. I will not stop. I will continue regardless of cost or consequence or sense. In this, William Afton becomes less a character than a force, less a person than a principle, the embodiment of stubborn persistence taken to its logical and horrifying extreme, existing long past the point where existence brings anything but suffering, because the alternative, non-existence, is somehow worse to the consciousness that continues to cling to being. Sleep now, listener, with the knowledge that all stories must end eventually, even William Afton's, even if that ending comes not through final destruction, but through gradual fading, through his narrative relevance declining until he's no longer worth bringing back, until even franchise necessity cannot justify another return, until he's finally allowed to rest not because he's defeated, but because he's no longer needed. That ending, quiet and anticlimactic, may be more fitting for William Afton than any dramatic final death. A character defined by persistence simply stopping, fading away, becoming a memory of lore rather than an active presence, finally released from the cycle not through fire or heroism, but through simple narrative completion. Rest peacefully, knowing that even the man who always came back will, someday, somehow, find an end, whether through destruction or irrelevance or simple storytelling exhaustion. His persistence, remarkable as it is, cannot truly be eternal, because nothing is, because even the most stubborn consciousness must eventually find that there are limits to how many times one can return, how many forms one can inhabit, how many iterations of the same cycle one can endure, before even the strongest will breaks and allows the long-delayed ending to finally arrive. May your dreams be free of golden rabbits and springlock failures, of fires that don't quite destroy and consciousnesses that won't quite fade. May you rest knowing that William Afton's story, for all its loops and returns and resurrections, serves ultimately as a reminder that true rest comes not from persistence, but from acceptance, not from refusing to die, but from allowing oneself to finally, peacefully, permanently let go. Good night, listener. Sleep well. And may you never, ever come back the way William Afton always does.